Now, in terms of the types of measurements scales that we could use, we need to consider two different main types. So, two broader categories. We have categorical scales and we have quantitative scales. Now, quantitative, you could probably guess what that is. It means that there's some numerical value used to measure, right? How many participants had coffee today? Or just looking at individual participants. On average, how many cups of coffee did participants have during the study? How many individuals came into a store, right? These are all quantitative. Now, categorical would be variables of measurement that place responses into categories. So, for example, what's your favorite dating app? Is it Bumble or I don't know the other ones, right? Tinder. You have all the options. You're choosing one. Let's say I limit you to one. What's your favorite one? I'm not asking you to rate them on a 1 to 10 scale. That would be more quantitative. I'm asking you to pick one of your favorite. I'm asking you to pick your favorite team. I'm asking you to pick one ethnicity, right? When you pick an ethnicity, you're picking one category, right? So that's a categorical variable, not a quantitative one. Categorical is when you choose which category does your preference fall into. Might not be preference, it might be your identity. Then you choose the option that best aligns with your identity as a participant, right? So that would be a categorical variable. So quantitative, there's some quantitative spectrum you're choosing from. Categorical, they're choices. Think more multiple choice. Whereas quantitative might be just give me your age or a Likert scale from the scale from 1 to 10. How strongly do you agree with this? Or it might ask you to order your preferences from the option you like the best to the option you like the least, right? These are quantitative. Categorical, you're just picking a category for your response as a participant. So just to give you an example of a categorical scale, we're going to go over the nominal scale. Our nominal scale is the only scale we're going to go over that's categorical. So keep that in mind. A nominal scale, the options that the participants have no numerical value. So for example, what's your favorite beverage? Pepsi, Coca-Cola, 7-Up, Dr. Pepper. Do they still make Dr. Pepper cactus cooler? You have all these options. Choose your favorite option. There's these categories you're choosing from, or the participant is choosing from. There's no numerical value associated with these choices, right? You're not saying that if they responded with Pepsi, that's a 10 on the soda scale. No. These are just the options they have. And again, I think of it as a categories in a multiple choice option. Maybe that might be a little confusing, but just keep in mind that there is no numerical difference between the options. These are just options you can choose from. What's your favorite anime? What's your favorite video game? What's your favorite TV show? And then it wouldn't be open-ended. You would have categories you can choose from. What do you prefer? Watching TV, reading a book, and you have all these other options, and then the participant chooses one, right? So think of it more as a forced choice question. That's a categorical measurement, okay? So let's go over some of the quantitative scales now. So keep in mind, I want you to remember that these scales are being used to measure our variable of interest. So just in case I didn't make that point earlier, just keep that in mind. What we're doing here is we're choosing a way to measure our variable of interest. You could use a nominal scale. What's your favorite soda? You can use an ordinal scale, right? An ordinal scale would look like this. So instead of asking, pick your favorite soda, you might ask, rank all these sodas from most favorite to least favorite, right? So in this case, this measurement does have, there is some value attached to the order things are placed in. Another example would be the outcome of a race, right? So you're going to have first, second, and third place, right? That does tell you something about who finished first and who finished last. But what it doesn't tell you is the spaces in between the options, first, second, third. So for example, going back to the soda example, well, I don't know the difference between their first option and their second option. These differences between first, second, and third are not meaningful, but it does give us some order that does have some meaning. All right, so interval scale. So the interval scale, the difference between interval scale and ratio scale can be a little tricky. So those of you who have already reviewed this will know this. It's tricky. So I'm going to focus on one key aspect between the two to help you differentiate. An interval scale does not have a true zero, meaning for that thing you're trying to measure, that scale that was designed, there is no true zero or complete absence of that thing you're trying to measure accounted for in that scale. So to give you an example, shoe size. You have size 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, right? There's an equal distance between each shoe size, right? That difference between each option is meaningful, right? You can know, okay, my kid is a size 6. You're not going to randomly jump to size 9. You know, okay, the next one is 7, right? The distance between each shoe option, at least in a given brand, is about the same. Now, I don't know the details, but about how much different, but you can kind of, there's meaning between those shoe sizes. The thing is, what makes this an interval scale and not a ratio scale is that there's no true zero. You might be thinking, well, you could not have a foot. That's true. You cannot have a foot, and that would mean an absence of a foot. But the scale, the way it was designed, 0 is actually a shoe size. And I'll put a picture of this, but a shoe size of 0 is actually for a newborn, like a very tiny, tiny, cute shoe. So 0 on this scale does not indicate absence of shoe size or feet size, however you want to describe it, right? So because of that, it's an interval scale. So don't focus so much on, in real life, can the thing I'm measuring not exist? Focus on how the scale was designed. The shoe size scale was designed so that 0 does not indicate an absence of shoe size, an absence of foot size. It actually indicates the smallest size possible, right? So it's not a ratio scale, it's an interval scale. Now, really quickly, the difference between each point on the scale, 1, 2, 3, or 1.5, 2, 2.5, and so on, that is meaningful, right? Ordinal scale, your preference between Coke and 7-Up and Cactus Cooler, those differences are not meaningful that between those different points. Again, in an ordinal example, who came first, second, and third? That's informative. We know who finished first. We know who finished second, and we know who finished third, but we don't know the time difference between first and second and third. The interval scale, right? These differences are meaningful. The difference between a size 5 and 7 shoe should be about the same between a 9 and 11 size shoe, right? But there's no true 0, right? That's what makes this a ratio scale. finally, the ratio scale. So the ratio scale has to do with a measurement scale that does have a true zero. It's quantitative, just like the interval scale was, but each point is meaningful. It has a true zero, and the distance between each point. So I said this by saying that each point is meaningful, but the distance between each point gives you some information about what you're measuring, right? So for example, if I told you I had $5 and $10, so let's say we're measuring money. If I told you I had $5 and $10, I don't have an extra hand, so this is 10. The difference is double, right? Money as a form of measuring wealth does tell you some information about these different points, right? 5 and 10, quantitative, and 10 is double what 5 is. This difference between this point and this point is meaningful, right? If we're looking at single dollars, we could say, okay, we know how to count that. The difference between $1 and $2 and the difference between 1,000 and 1,001 is the same. There's some meaning there. In addition, there can be a true zero in this scale, right? You can't have no money. So you can't have zero money, hopefully not, but you can have zero. Whereas for these other examples, it was the shoe size, for example, is zero doesn't mean absence. For money, zero does mean absence of money, right? There's other examples that you might have come across, like temperature, and how zero doesn't indicate lack of temperature. That example tends to confuse students. It confuses me. But, that's an example of where you have a zero, and it doesn't mean lack of temperature. If the zero doesn't mean lack of, absence of, then it cannot be a ratio scale, right? So think about IQ. IQ, it'd be hard to argue that IQ is a ratio scale because you get points just for filling out your name, right? So to argue that there's a complete absence of intelligence in a living human being, that would be a hard argument to make, right? Because yes, there might be some difficulties, impairments, challenges for different individuals, different experience with schooling, but to say that there's zero intelligence, you wouldn't be able to argue that, right? So think about that when you're assessing, is it an interval or ratio scale? Interval, interval and ratio, the different points of measurement are meaningful, and the differences between the measurements give you some information, right? You're not just looking at most to least liked. You're looking at, well, okay, shoe size, how far did that person run? How often does that person eat? These numbers give you some meaning. You can look at the intervals between these different options that they could choose as a participant, and they are meaningful. Interval, there is no true zero. Ratio, there is a true zero. So, for example, did you eat this week? How often did you eat this week? Right? I have a scale or options that go from 0 to 100. Is that 0 meaningful? Yes. You could have not eaten this week. For ratio, shoe size. What's your shoe size? Can somebody respond 0 and it means absence, complete absence of shoe size? No? Then it's interval, right? So keep that in mind. Those are key things you're looking for when you're differentiating those two specific type of scales. Does it have a true 0? Think that through. See, does that make sense? Like if I told you a researcher was measuring how many people visited the store, would this likely be an interval or a ratio scale? I'm not going to give you the answer. If you want the answer to that, reach out to me and ask me, but you should be able to answer that. If I'm counting how many people visited a store, would that likely be an interval or a ratio scale? Okay, if you have questions, reach out to me. I'm always available.